And now, today's featured speakers are Jyoti Aggarwala, MBA 87, and Matthew McDonald, class of 06. Jyoti is a senior private markets business development professional and placement agent registered with Profor Securities, LLC. She has more than 20 years of experience raising capital for small, emerging, impact, and diverse private asset managers. Jyoti is a member of PEWIN, an organization for senior female investment professionals, and a member of the Impact Capital Forum, advancing impact investing and social enterprise sectors. She also enjoys volunteering through High Water Women by volunteering to teach youth on financial literacy. Matthew McDonald is an employment and litigation partner at Clare Harrison Harvey Brandsburg, LLP, and a member of both the New York and Pennsylvania Bar Associations. His area of expertise is in advising employers and senior executives, particularly within financial services, on matters concerning employment policies, agreements, and non-competes and non-solicits. He has represented parties in a wide range of employment disputes. In addition, Matthew serves as a member of the Clare Harrison's Small Business Task Force, which was formed to assist employers in response to the new regulations and legislation applicable due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Jyoti Aggarwala and Matthew McDonald. Thank you both.
Emily, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen so we can have the deck going. Here we go. And thank you for the introductions. Okay, some technical problems here. I'm not able to advance my screen here. Okay, here we go. Okay, very important, securities professional and lawyer team up, we have to have a disclaimer. So this is for educational purposes only. This is our agenda. We're going to speak for about 30 minutes and leave a lot of time for questions. So I do want to give my thank yous to a lot of people at Bentley, but most particularly, I want to frame this discussion that how is it that a lawyer, employment lawyer in particular, got together with a private market professional to talk about the future of work. And the answer to that is simply this, that it is to highlight that we have many tools in our toolbox to create change in corporate behavior. And as we know, as citizens, you can vote. As students, we protest. As consumers, we choose from our spending patterns, what we choose. And here we want to highlight that there has been a movement in the financial markets that is way beyond the current situation that's been going on slowly for a long period of time, where we are using shareholder action and engagement as a tool for corporate behavior change. Not only that, we also have sustainability and sustainable investing. So in looking further, so backgrounds. So ESG is really what has now developed the environmental, social, and governance, which is the investor tool to challenge the status quo around non-financial issues and really drive change. And the pandemic, the global pandemic, is a non-financial issue. It is different from the global financial crisis that we faced now almost 10 years ago. And these non-financial but material issues do matter when we look at our society, our consumption, as well as our investments. So quick timeline of ESG investing. And it's been called socially responsible investing and then responsible investing. But I have to call out the 70s and the famous essay in the New York Magazine written by Milton Friedman from the 70s, talking about the only purpose of a business, a social responsible business, is to deliver profits for its shareholders. And you will see that the shareholder alone is not enough. And you really have to think of stakeholder capitalism. So there are three pillars of sustainable ESG investing, and those are environment, there is social, human capital is what we're going to focus on today, and shareholders have already been investing and speaking with their investments. You can see there's been a dramatic increase even in the sovereign wealth funds, and Japan has increased 30%. It's because the Japanese government has gotten on board. And of course, millennials, women, policy reform through regulation, as well as the proliferation of a lot of risk mitigation and analytical tools have really shown that ESG issues matter. And this is from BlackRock. You can see that there is a growth in assets that are managed in this responsible kind of way. So there are many different strategies, and we're only going to look at shareholder engagement as one of the primary strategies for creating corporate change in behavior. And I want to point to some examples. And some of the examples that we have seen in the past start as early as 1993. That's when, through shareholder advocacy and voting, Revlon committed to reformulate all of its nail enamel and nail care products to be toluene-free by 1993. In March 2000, Hershey agreed not to use sugar from GMO beets. In February 2015, McDonald's replaced all foam beverage cups at 14,000 restaurants. In 2015 as well, Coca-Cola agreed to recycle 50% of its bottles and cans. Exxon agreed to publish its first ever report on its exposure to carbon asset risk, for the very first time launching the concept of carbon asset risk. In 2020, Procter & Gamble agreed to make 90% of packaging recyclable by this year. There have been many, many more initiatives that have come about on corporate changes in behavior as a result of the global pandemic. And you could see Amazon has committed to upgrade its infrastructure by spending $4 billion this year. And that is really towards employee safety. So a quick word, this is how there are many ratings like bond ratings. Microsoft is a top holding because it gets good marks on all these factors of carbon emission, corporate governance, human development, privacy and data security. Netflix does not do as well. And so the metrics to measure human capital is what we're going to look at today. And of course, you can look at corporate social responsibility. That is very binary. Do you have a policy? Yes or no? It starts with a policy. Then what are your targets? That too is binary. You know, for example, you have some diversity goals. So do you have diversity in your workforce? But then when you dig down into metrics, you could say what percentage of your employees are female. And employee health and safety, data privacy are going to become important factors. So we took a deep dive in going from the top 3 pillars of ESG investing into human capital, the social S part of it. And then within human capital, we looked at all these different areas, a living wage and basic benefits, systems to safeguard employees. And here do you have a sexual harassment policy that follows the Me Too movement? Worker safety is no longer just about manufacturing or construction, or in energy-related areas like offshore drillers, but you also have that in the workplace because of the health concerns that we have as a result of this pandemic. Of course, some of the other important metrics here are towards career building, fair, engaging workplace. Fulfilling meaningful work is a new one. Work environment is a new one. And then wealth building opportunities have always been a focus. 80% of the global workforce has been impacted in this pandemic. And we've seen that certain industries have been hurt more than others. Executive pay has come under a lot of scrutiny. You could see from this Economic Policy Institute chart, CEOs make 278 times more than the typical workers. And Just Capital has issued a corporate response tracker, and they are actually tracking what the largest employers are doing. And 33 of the 100 largest employers have announced executive pay cuts in response to the pandemic. JP Morgan Chase's CEO, Jamie Dimon, he addresses the issues of why we must emerge from the crisis with a more inclusive economy. And he talks about the critical need for businesses to think, act, and invest for a common good. So quickly on ESG investing, and there is a problem. It seems that ESG ETFs, they short fossil fuels and they go long technology. Well, the problem is that the pandemic has intensified the problem of underemployment and income inequality in choosing, because these tech companies and pharma companies, they have fewer companies per employee. So it's leading to a deepening of inequality. Just a shout out to Bentley's Center for Women and Business and to the work that they're doing there, including Trish Foster and Jaro Fong, who recently conducted a webinar talking about inclusion, equity, diversity, and now belonging. We think that this will certainly be an important part of remote work. Referring back to the webinar that was hosted by the Center for Women and Business, they talked about working remotely may stay, and new employees would be introduced through videos. There would be a lot of frequent coffee and happy hour breaks that people would take. And if you are online all day, adding in some mindfulness practice like meditation and yoga would also be the future. Cannot ignore racial justice. This is an area that I'm really proud of. I've been working in my career in private markets towards racial justice, which is meaning that institutional investors are allocating more to diverse, women-led, not only venture capital, but private equity, asset managers. And that is part of the work metric of opportunities for wealth creation and for empowerment. But there is a lot that can be done beyond just looking at what is the law. Companies can have anti-discriminatory policies. They can disclose more data. There are a lot of companies that are ranking and rating data. I showed you the example of MSCI. And then we can also look at the systemic biases in some of our financial systems, for example, credit ratings, which are biased, where you have to have some assets for you to consider a good credit, rather than looking at the example. In this case, I would say that the developing world, or as euphemistically called the third world, has been first. Micro-lending shows that you don't have to have any assets, and yet those women working in very rural areas are good credit worthy. And mortgage lending has also had its issues around racial justice. There were areas in Brooklyn and Bedford-Stuyvesant that were redline, and many banks would not lend to people in those areas. So we have to look at all these issues, and we have to make it more inclusive. Also look at whether our lending practices are predatory, charging higher interest rates to the very poor. That did happen in microlending. And I already talked about private equity, how there's more institutional capital coming up to diverse and first-time managers and women-led managers. So to conclude, we think that the future of work reimagined is more gender equal, collaborative, mobile and adaptive. And in this area, I would say that I was sharing with Emily before we got started. I myself have been a remote worker and working from home since 2006. I've approached my career very entrepreneurially, and I'm very grateful that the industry I'm in has allowed me to do that, because I had been, for personal and for work-life balance reasons, I've needed to have that flexibility. And of course, dignified, equitable, accessible and sustainable, and diverse and inclusive. So with that, I did want to make this comment that a lot of data is being talked about, that the human capital is in conflict with the environment. The pandemic has shown that we do need to be mindful of the environment. And I cannot resist at this point to bring in ancient wisdom tradition and say, Om Shanti, 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 which is, may I be peaceful, may everybody else around me be peaceful, and may the environment be well. So it's about inclusiveness for everything. With that, I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Matt, and we're going to have an interactive discussion to talk about what are some legal issues related to returning to work, and we can then dig down deeper. So with that, Matt.
Thank you, Jyoti, and thank you very much to Emily and Bethany. I didn't get the chance at the beginning. I do want to thank you for all the hard work you did in setting this up and coordinating it. And so, as we look at some of these issues that are just on the screen, this slide in particular is really focused on legal challenges in returning to work. So as we talk about when to reopen the office, maybe one of the most pressing issues, and then how to do it. But if you look at when to reopen the office, that is really more, I'd say, of an employer side issue, since obviously the employees have a little bit less control over that. But what our firm did, and what we've been seeing a lot for clients and what we'd recommend doing, is it really needs to be a flexible process, and a process that is really done in a considered way and with a lot of input and hopefully buy-in from employees. At the end of the day, obviously the threshold issue is it's got to be legal first, right? There's a lot of shutdown orders that are still in place. In places that are allowing reopening, there are a lot of restrictions around social distancing. Certain jurisdictions require the wearing of masks and the provision of masks to both employees, and requiring customers to wear masks. So that's, for example, a restriction in Pennsylvania. So it is, you have to do it legally. But once you meet the legal requirements of your jurisdiction, you then also need to be very cognizant of what will people do. What we recommend is a survey. Survey your employees, see what they're comfortable with. Obviously, it's got to meet the business needs, but you really need to have buy-in from your employees, or else it's not going to be a productive environment. If you have employees that are uncomfortable coming to work or won't come to work. Obviously, no one wants to be looking for employees in this environment. It's very challenging to interview employees and to find someone who's the right fit, and then to integrate them into your culture. But conversely, employees don't want to be looking for jobs for the same reasons. So, there's a lot of, our number one advice is to really think about what you need to do, what you can effectively do remotely. And then in that regard, making sure that your employees are comfortable as much as they can be with what you land on and how you go about doing it, and seeing their concerns. And so, unfortunately, I'd love to be able to give great sort of blanket advice, but it's going to really depend on your business and on your work environment. If you're in a high-rise building, you're going to have to worry about things like elevators. If you're in a standalone building that you own and control, then that the employer owns and controls, it's a very different scenario. So it's really going to be context dependent, I think, on when to reopen.
Matt, just on this part of laws and getting back to the
Sure.
office, I was in discussion with a manager in China, and he said that he went back to his office and he was able to go into his building, but the security guard who had been seeing him for all those 10 years that he worked in that building asked him to pull out his phone. He had to download an app for contact tracing. He had to go through, of course, the things you mentioned, wear a mask, wear gloves, to enter the building, and then social distancing, carry his own lunch. So what are some of the differences that we're going to face in a democracy, and that's going to look more like not a democracy?
Sure. I think it's a great question, and I think it really feeds into the next topic, which is screening. That is going to be something that a lot of employers are going to undoubtedly want to implement, and I think it's something that employees are going to have to learn to adjust to. But there's a lot of issues around screening, and so first is the federal agencies have said they're not going to deem it a violation of federal law in order to, if you decide to screen employees before letting them back in. So that's first and foremost. Certain states that I mentioned are dictating that you wear masks. So that's obviously going to look very different. It'd be something that people have to be comfortable with. But on the screening front, the issues that arise are, first, the fact that an administrative agency says it will be deemed legal doesn't make it so. The courts are the ultimate arbiter of whether or not it is permissible under the various federal and state and local regulatory regimes to allow for screening. I think as a practical matter, it's going to be permitted. We don't obviously have the case law yet to go through that, but it would be unlikely that there are going to be many states or judges that are going to interpret this situation as not being an appropriate and reasonable step to take. So that's first and foremost. But then with screening comes a lot of issues around what happens to that data and how is it used. So, one of the things that is is talked about, and I think you'll be seeing a lot of places, is temperature checks. That temperature check might be imposed by your employer. It might be imposed by the building that you work in. The buildings that in high-rise buildings in cities, they're employers too. They have doormen, they have supers, they have, people who manage the building. And those employees are entitled to protections as well. And so that may mean temperature checks for everybody who wants to get into the building. But that then raises issues around what does that mean for the employee? Do they have to be paid? The answer is going to depend on the jurisdiction you're in, but probably no. If it's just a high temperature, it's going to, but your individual locality might change that, as well as whether or not you have sick leave or vacation leave to take. So it's going to be a very employer by employer issue, and one that employees should certainly know the answer to. You're going to have issues around what happens to the data, who gets it, how is it collected, so who's performing the test, and how do they perform it safely? How do you keep employees safe while they're waiting to be tested? Where are they waiting? And then, of course, you're going to have the inevitable issues that arise around what happens if they are in a situation where where somebody gets sick at work as a result of these measures, or maybe just not taking appropriate safety measures. What happens? Is the employer liable? We don't have the answers to those questions yet. What we do know is that when you get the information around temperatures, you've got to control it. You cannot disseminate it, and you've got to try to protect the employee's information. So if it's temperature checks, some of the, for example, there's certain cameras you could use, which would be permissible, though you should certainly, depending upon your locale, make sure that employees are aware that they're being filmed and that their temperature is being taken via the camera. But you have to safeguard that data. You can't just disseminate around the office. You can't publicly send somebody home. You've got to, in the best way that you can, try to avoid letting others know that someone has screened positively and you've asked them to leave, and then restrict that to only decision makers that need the information. You also can't take any sort of retaliatory action against those individuals. It's not unforeseeable that someone will say, we'll say you're out for a month, or, firing people based upon it. It seems ridiculous that a transitory illness might result in those issues, but they could. You also have to deal with the various state and federal regimes around what you have to do with respect to COVID-19 leave. It's different based upon the size of the employer and the state and city that you're in. So these are all issues that, we're all going to have to figure out the answers to as we move. But employers have to be very cognizant of. It's a complicated situation at the moment. And employees need to know that they have the right to have any medical information gathered by the employer kept confidential and not disseminated. And could be difficult in a situation where somebody's asked to leave and then they don't come around for 2 weeks. it may not be very hard for the other employees to figure out why. And that leads into the next question then of you more important employees who may have been exposed to that individual. So we're going to have to figure out how to navigate that process, and employers are going to have to, as best they can, try to avoid disclosing as they try to let employees know, maybe you shouldn't come around for 2 weeks either because you were exposed to this person. So, in that regard, as employees do just adjust to that, you then have to ask the question, what if someone cannot or will not come to the office? And on a similar vein, what about employees that are at particular risk? What about someone who is in an age bracket that is at particular risk if they were to become ill? What about someone who has a pre-existing condition, a heart condition, a breathing condition, diabetes, fairly, common issues where if someone has those conditions, it might be more reasonable. It might even rise to the level of a reasonable accommodation, depending upon the work environment, to let them work remotely if they can, under, again, the federal laws as well as the state and city laws. And that, sort of similarly bleeds into the next topic. But before I do, the reality is most employees probably don't have the right to just say, I'm not coming in. There are no current laws or regs that would allow you to say, I shouldn't have to come into the office if the employer is otherwise following all applicable rules and laws. It is still an at-will employment country with very limited exceptions. And so for the most part, if an employee doesn't feel comfortable coming to work, they're going to have to evaluate whether or not the employer could take adverse action against them. And there's something that would protect them unless they fit into some sort of a protected class around the decision. For example, if you could try to make up the claim that if you might be able to argue if you have diabetes and you do your job remotely, maybe it's a reasonable accommodation to do that. We don't know. That hasn't been tested yet. It might be difficult, but it might be. So, Jyoti, did you have any thoughts on that before I move forward?
What are some other issues that are coming up from this working at home? And in particular, I want to point out, childcare, daycare. I think you had some interesting points here to address in terms of COVID leave, childcare. We talked about data privacy and security a little bit. You dig down, particularly how it is. I think a lot of people who wrote in questions, they want to know, what is the future of work for women going to look like? Because women are not only providing childcare, helping to keep the home going in the kitchen and keeping it clean, but also working.
Sure, it's an incredibly difficult question because you're absolutely right. That a lot of the brunt of those issues, and study after study that shows it, gets borne by women when you have childcare issues. And so the problem becomes, how do you balance that, especially whether it's returning to work or remaining remotely? Either way, young children still need to be cared for. And so it becomes difficult to, and in fact, I don't know if it's coming out on the camera, but you can hear my infant screaming in the background here. It's a problem. There's no great solution. So it certainly would be, and there are certainly laws that say you have to accommodate parents that have childcare issues, but there are limits to that, and there are limits based on your locality as to how far that goes. It's not necessarily going to be a blanket answer, and it really doesn't matter if you return to work or not. That's an issue employers need to grapple with. Obviously, I would advise them to be as flexible as they can, but the reality is there are limits to how flexible they need to be. And at some point they can say it's too much and we're going to have to find somebody else, unfortunately. So that's just from the legal perspective. Obviously, from an employment perspective, that's a pretty terrible line to take. And I think you send an awful message to your workforce if you do that. And so I certainly would advise employers to do everything they can to avoid it. But there's no good solution in a time when childcare may even be less available than normal, and where parents very reasonably may not feel comfortable sending their children into a group environment if they can avoid it.
So Matt, there's been a lot of spotlight on racial justice and income inequality. Of course, I touched upon gender pay equity in some of my discussion. But as respect to working from home, what if you are in a large city and you are in a small apartment and you have no space, and worse, you're in a neighborhood where there is a spotty internet connection, and we're coming into the summer, there's no air conditioning. How do you hold on to your job, work remotely, and deal with some of the infrastructure issues because you come from an underserved community or under-resourced?
Again, it's incredibly challenging. I mean, it is unfortunately something where there aren't that many laws that are going to protect the employee in that circumstance. If the employee can do their job remotely, and there is, in the current circumstance, it is one of the exceptions to protecting people around, if they've screened positively for COVID, for example, if they've actually tested positive, then, they have a right to work remotely depending upon who their employer is, if they can. But it is a very challenging thing insofar as employers really don't have the obligation to work with someone who is not capable of working remotely if they've moved to a remote environment. And what obligations the employer has actually become even more complicated for the employer, and employees should be aware of this, is it may change. Because a lot of the laws, the federal level laws, are they're broad and narrow at the same time. They cover generally adverse employment actions, but in a much narrower category and way than state and local laws do. And they don't govern a lot of the issues around contracts that are so important to employees, particularly things like non-competes, non-solicits, confidentiality agreements, the extent to which what counts as a protected class. And the protected class is things you cannot be fired for being a member of. So that is to a large extent expanded by, dictated by state and local law. And now where that issue can arise is, for example, New York City and Philadelphia have much more expansive protections than New York State and Pennsylvania. And New Jersey has a whole other set of restrictions, right? And so I just use that area because it's very common for employees to be commuting in or working for Pennsylvania or New York-based employers, but living in New Jersey. And so what you can see then is now someone's moving remote for a long term, indefinite term, or maybe permanently. Now the employer has to consider, am I subject with respect to that employee to the restrictions of, if they're in New Jersey, maybe New Jersey law. If they're working from, say, Westchester instead of commuting into New York City, now do I have to follow the New York City laws? So it presents some very real implications for employees in terms of the protections they have. New York City has one of the most protective and broad laws in the country. And they've been layering on more laws around, for example, things like confidentiality agreements, not being able to keep quiet sexual harassment claims except for under certain limited circumstances. And whether or not you have that protection can be really dictated by where you're working from. Same thing, a question very frequently comes up is restrictive covenants. What you can do in Pennsylvania versus New Jersey versus New York is radically different. And it can be broader and more narrow at the same time. You get blunt rules, like Pennsylvania says you have to compensate someone if you enter into a restrictive covenant during employment. Continued employment isn't enough. So I'd actually write you a check, give you some form of benefit in order to impose a restrictive covenant while you're working here. I don't have to do that in New Jersey. Well, if I have an employee who's now remote connecting from New Jersey, you have to consider whether or not I can impose a restrictive covenant on that person and whether or not their existing non-compete or non-solicit will be enforceable now. So it has very, very real ramifications as you spread your workforce out around the country and across state and city lines.
So Matt, before...
I shifted a bit from your question, I apologize for that.
No,
but it's because I don't have a great answer for it.
So I could ask you many questions, including around what about doctors who are now doing video screening or really talking to patients across state lines and the regulations, how they're changing. But I did promise to stop at the half hour and open it up for questions. Perhaps I'll stop. Any other points on this?
Yeah, I would say that the one last thing I did just want to mention before we do shift to questions is data privacy doesn't just extend to health information. It's an issue that employers and employees need to be kept comfortable and grapple with, insofar as you're going to obviously have business information that's being transmitted remotely now. and trade secrets and confidential information, but you're also going to have employee information that's being transmitted remotely a lot as well. Social security numbers, compensation information, health information, and you're now exposing yourself to attacks. Whereas if you might have had a sophisticated IT network in your office building, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but now your vulnerability is potentially at each of the individual employees' homes and their particular web internet connection, their computers. And so you really need to be careful around how that is set up and making sure that you're taking efforts, and employees have to know they have the right to have that information protected as that's being transmitted. So it's just something to keep in mind, is that is as simple as things people don't think of, like smart devices, smart speakers. Alexa and Google aren't always listening. Our firm, for example, has said you're not allowed to have those devices in the room from where you're working. So you need to think about that at home as well, as you're now transmitting more of your personal data around. There have been data breaches for huge recordings of, Amazon and Google, people, just the devices recording people in the normal course of their homes have leaked to third parties and been placed on the internet. So you need to be careful with that as you're now working from home and transmitting more of your data electronically, or even just over the phone in a room with a smart device you're not otherwise thinking about.
Okay, with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll come back to the...
Thank you both for the presentation. We have received a few questions, although you did answer some of them, especially around the temperature check cameras. It sounds like as long as they're being careful with the data, not sharing it, and letting employees know that they're being, that their temperature is being checked in that way, that is going to be an acceptable form of screening employees as they come in. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that is generally correct. But you do want to make sure, particularly around, I would emphasize, employees need to be notified and need to be agreeing to that in some fashion, because there are localities that are what's called one-party consent state versus two-party consent state. One party is anybody to the conversation can agree to record you and collect data about you. Two-party is both sides have to agree. So surreptitious recording in certain states is actually a felony. And that can extend to things like temperature check cameras. You just have to be careful. It's unlikely in a work environment, but there's no reason to, you don't want to be the test case for whether or not that's criminal.
And a question for both of you. Do you see that this is a passing phase as it regards to the future of work, or do you think things will really change for the long term?
Jyoti, I'll let you jump in. I've been talking for
All
a while.
right, I'll go first.
Give him a break.
Yeah. I think that this has been a wake-up call for everyone to, I think I'm in New York City, so 9/11 was one of those wake-up calls about what really matters to you, what's a priority. And I think this global pandemic is in some ways brought people more together. Look at us. I've been at so many Bentley alumni events, and that's how I met Matt. But we, are able to connect on a broader basis with all of our network. That's a silver lining. And if you can be working from home and you can have that work-life balance, I would tend to say that many people will either leave the corporate work or at least, ask for more changes that create that balance, because this was a health crisis.
I would absolutely agree with Jyoti. I do not think this is going to be a situation we're going to rubber band back and go back to business as usual. And I don't know many people in the employment world that do. It is certainly going to usher in some structural shifts in both, now that employers have been forced to figure this out. They were really made to make this work. And now that they see how it can work and that it does for a lot of businesses, there's not going to be, I don't believe, that drive to get everybody back into the office 5 days a week. It just doesn't make any sense from a cost perspective. You already had businesses that were moving towards that sort of a model where they could, where you had tech companies that were entirely remote effectively. You had certain banking industry companies where, I think Amex is a famous example, where they shifted to a lot of people not having their own desks at all. You have to come into a shared desk environment. That trend is not going to be reversed now that everyone's been forced to make it work if they can. You're going to see these new challenges be adopted, I think, going forward by a lot of employers, or these new solutions to these challenges.
And Emily, we started the discussion with comment about 70s and Milton Friedman, but that was really post-war, monetarist with capitalism. But I think we're now back to now looking at work from perspective of going back to even Keynes, because government intervention at the time of a depression or a time of inflationary periods in boom times is what was the thinking going back to Keynes. And we've seen not only the global crisis, but even now, there has been so much, throwing everything in the kitchen sink at the problem in terms of fiscal stimulus. And there is a complete disconnect between what is happening in the stock market versus what's happening on the main street. We are moving towards technology. These are some very broad trends. And I cannot imagine that if we had video conferencing, or if we didn't have ability to have high-speed internet, how we would be able to continue working, or even, technology has enabled us, and that's a silver lining. However, technology has also shown that all the people who are working in retail, who are, have small businesses, who rely on a daily wage, there are serious structural issues, and yes, income inequality. And I think these are the things that we as a society will have to really think about more seriously.
Absolutely. We had an earlier session on the economy and some of the industries that are most impacted, as you mentioned, will really change forever. Going to some additional questions. What is the liability of a company if an employee ends up contracting COVID at work, or even a daycare? Do they have liability if the parents, if their child contracts COVID?
Well, that is a great question, and it's one for which there's still no good answer. I think that it's probably going to boil down to, just like anything else in that sort of a realm in terms of an injury, whether effectively an injury, probably treated as an injury under the law, as to whether or not reasonable measures were taken. And I think you probably actually face potentially greater liability as a business or an employer to third parties than to your own workforce. We don't know what it's going to look like in terms of how that sorts out legally. I certainly would not want to be on the side of be in a situation where an employer has failed to follow whatever rules or regulations are applicable to them that results in someone becoming ill. But the reason I think you face more liability to third parties is, or this may end up being a workman's comp issue. I mean, I haven't researched it, and frankly, I don't know that anyone has. A pandemic, whether or not a pandemic, or at least has a good answer to it, whether or not a pandemic qualifies for workman's comp as compared to some other form of relief against an employer. But third parties, that's not going to be an issue. You're going to have to deal with those sorts of litigations, and it's impossible to know how it's going to sort out. I would be shocked if you don't see it, especially where someone is negligent in some fashion. But there will be a lot of hurdles in that litigation, given how virulent this virus is. How do you prove that you got it at work and not somewhere else? And so that's where I think you're probably going to see a lot of limitations on liability, is that you have to establish you got it at work, or at least that it's more likely than not you got it at work, and it's going to be hard to do that, I think.
And probably the same would be true then if your child contracted it at daycare.
Correct. You're going to face the same sort of issue around how do I prove it was daycare and not some other way, especially when you have asymptomatic transmission, people who never show symptoms. How do you prove that you didn't get it some other way? It will be exceptionally hard. I'm sure you will see it litigated, and I'm sure we'll find out. Unfortunately, as with many things in the law, you get that answer sometimes 2 or 3 years too late.
Right.
I would certainly advise anyone to take appropriate measures to try to avoid it, as you also don't want to be the test case for that litigation. We're responsible for making people sick.
We have some questions around the social ramifications. So what are we seeing from companies or employers to maintain those social connections? If either of you can speak to that, you know, will this be damaging? Are there going to be new policies instituted to keep people socially engaged as well as engaged with their work?
I'll go back to the Center for Women in Business and the webinar that they did. There were some great suggestions of what is appearing, and many companies are doing different things. But, you know, talking to your colleagues, and particularly people you're working with on a regular basis and a team, you know, we could say this creative collaboration, working remotely, to get to know your colleagues in a different kind of way, other than their professional competency or work environment. That, you know, you discover that your colleague is actually a barista and you know, aficionado of all the wonderful coffees, and has all the grinders, you know, down to tea, or that, you know, you, like me, I have a daily yoga practice. I think those are some nice things that are coming out from a social interaction. But joint activities, you always had team building activities, and people are being creative about how to bring them online. I know that a lot of offsites are now virtual, and in some ways that is distracting. But things like having time for each person to talk about what they are focused on, what their priorities are, who they are. In some way, the virtual background gives you a little bit more time.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Jyoti. I would also say that I think it is more important than ever. And I've seen some very creative ideas. I'll admit I'll steal one from a friend's business insofar as you know, doing online trivia nights. With there are, you know, services, a lot of places that were providing trivia to bars are now doing it online. Things of that nature I think it's important for businesses to invest in, because you do want to keep that connection. So that way you do keep that bond and that you know, spirit amongst employees as well as the company culture. But also, you know, in a similar vein, I suggest that employees try hard to make sure they're getting on their managers' radars. It is something you do not want to, you know, you could be quietly putting your head down doing your work, and that's something that, you know, even in an office environment, it can be troubling for people, employees that are seeking to get ahead, and that making sure you're being recognized for your accomplishments. But especially coming into this, where certain, you know, a lot of individuals have the belief that if you're working from home, you're not really working. You need to make sure that your employer knows you are really working. And so I do think it's important, even from the employee standpoint, not just the employers, to try to make sure they're getting on the radar of their coworkers and their managers, you know, calling them, emailing them, making sure they know that they're engaged and maintaining that connection for their own personal advancement.
That's an important
And Emily,
point.
it's the social, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
the social issues for a big city are very different from smaller cities. As I see public transportation, can you really feel safe taking the public transportation to get to your place of work? Matt talked about, you know, just the example of the tri-state area, how the laws are so different in each state. And there are so many commuters who are going to the big city. So it's not going to be the same.
Yeah, that leads to the next question. Are there any radical options that employers are considering for having employees return to work? I think wearing a mask and being tested for having a thermometer test your temperature is pretty radical, but are there any other things that have come to light in your work with employers and companies?
I don't know if it's, I guess it would depend. I mean, this would be certainly a radical solution from months or years ago, but in the current environment, what I don't think is unusual. In fact, it seems to be something that a lot of offices, especially ones that work effectively remotely, are considering, and it's not dissimilar from what our firm is doing. So I wouldn't call it radical. I think it's an appropriate safety measure. But what you're seeing is some sort of a screening process being employed, limitations on the number of people who can be in an elevator at one time. the requirement that all masks are worn at all times, unless you know, maybe an exception for in your own office, like your own, if you have an individual office, staggering the workforce. That way you have people who are only coming in once, either every, you know, split it by weeks or every other day, dramatically enhanced cleaning, bars on all meetings and closing of all conference space, barring all visitors from the building, at least from your office area. And then, you know, requiring social distancing on things like in lobbies and hallways, and having one-way hallways, requiring social distancing even in restrooms. And it's, you know, so we are seeing those sorts of things implemented. That is, that regime that I just described is very similar to what Claire Harrison is implementing. You know, it's a little bit easier for a law firm in a lot of ways, insofar as obviously we can function very effectively remotely. But and then, of course, as you're staggering the workforce, you know, one of the things that you can do is making sure that people who are allowed in on a particular day don't have adjacent offices. It's even more complicated in a cubicle setting. They don't have making sure that adjacent cubicles are not coming in, and that you have enough space between them. Trying to erect some sort of a greater barrier even around cubicles, like seeing, you know, increased partitions to make sure that you're separating as much as possible. So, I mean, that, I think, you know, 6 months ago, if that was your method, obviously, of preventing disease spread in the virus in an office, it would be viewed as pretty radical. I think for today, it's certainly a strong measure, but I do think that is also a measure that you're going to see far more often and more the norm than the exception, if you can have employees that effectively work remotely.
It looks like we have one final question, which you both chimed in about making communication becoming harder, or how you can go about communicating during this more impersonal format. But what about all of the unemployed currently? Do you believe that most of those jobs will not come back, or do you think that is there room for a new workforce that we haven't thought of yet?
I do want to address unemployment from the perspective of students. You know, we are a university network here, alumni. And unfortunately, a lot of companies are saying to their interns that, you know, yes, we hired you, but we don't need you to come anymore. And that, I think, is going to make young people really think about whether they want to work for an employer who gives them an offer and then wants to say, come back after a year, when, you know, we have better visibility and budget, and also the kind of learning environment. How do you learn? You learn from your peers. So I think that may move the young people from, you know, doing different things. And
that's a good plug, Jyoti. If anyone has any creative internship or job opportunities for our most recent graduates, for those of you that are still on the call, please let us know, because certainly that's something that Bentley would like to help foster.
yes.
And I would agree with Jyoti. I also think it's going to depend, so much of it is going to depend on the industry you're in. You know, if you're talking about a retail or a restaurant type industry, a hotel industry, you know, hospitality generally, I think you're going to have a lot more of those jobs that don't come back, or to the extent that they come back, it's going to be returning their own workforce, maybe in some reduced capacity, not necessarily hiring new outside people. And I mean, that's a lot of what we're seeing, is that the people who laid off or furloughed are bringing back some percentage of their workforce, but are not necessarily reaching out to find new employees. The exception being, there are certain industries where that's not necessarily true. I mean, tech is still hiring. It's booming in a lot of ways. Not across the board. I mean, there are certainly tech companies that don't do well in this sort of environment. I mean, if you're in like a more of the backbone of providing the tech, you're not necessarily in a good position. But if you are, you know, providing some sort of software service, certainly. But then also, I mean, I'm not seeing it. It may come down the pike. We'll see at year end, but I'm not seeing a huge boom in financial services layoffs yet. Things of that nature, because I think that financial services can more effectively move remotely, and there isn't the diminished need for their work. So, you know, fortunately for Bentley grads, that's hopefully good news. That being said, hiring is definitely a little bit more sketchy right now, insofar as people don't know what their budgets are going to look like for next year. They don't feel great about it. Certainly hiring got interrupted as you were looking at the beginning of the year is when this hit, and so that might have been during a more traditional hiring period. You had people that got delayed, and you're going to have maybe some hesitancy to taking on more costs if you don't have to. So financial services and tech is probably where the types of industries you want to be in right now. But there's no, until we come out the other side, I don't know many employers that are super excited about taking on more fixed costs than they have to. Or I guess not really fixed costs, but there's certainly a lot of friction when you're separating an employee that you prefer to avoid if you can.
And one area of tremendous growth in hiring young people and even senior professionals is in the nonprofit world. Just today, there were 4 foundations who collectively announced that they are going to commit an additional $1.7 billion over the next 3 years into programs that are targeted towards their mission, including racial equity, social justice, higher education, climate solutions, supporting vulnerable communities. These are the places where money is pouring in, and it wouldn't be a bad thing for summer interns seeking summer internships to go for unusual sectors where they wouldn't, the typical consulting, banking, or opportunities.
Well, thank you both. We have a couple minutes remaining. I didn't know if there was any last comment you'd like to say on this topic.
No more comments on this topic, but I just wanted to say a big shout out to Bentley, because not only has Bentley now have 2 women presidents, with the 7th and 8th both being women-led, but the 35 years ago when I arrived at Bentley, there was also a Center for Ethics in Business, and there's concerted effort even before any of these issues, the global pandemic started, where Bentley has been leading in areas like diversity and inclusion, with having alumni. We had the very first get together, led with a trustee of the Bentley board on diversity, and getting all the diverse alumni together. So just a very big shout out to Bentley. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. There's certainly much more to be done on that front, and we'll keep doing the hard work there. Matthew?
So I will echo Jyoti, who I think already said it very, very eloquently. But I would also add that, just for assistance purposes, if you need it, the second to last slide of the deck does have links to Claire Harrison's COVID-19 Resource Center. And so there are a lot of articles that have been put out that if you want to learn more about some of the legal protections out there, feel free. It's a publicly available resource. You can see that information. And then, if any other questions arise, if anybody has anything we didn't get to, or, we only touched on briefly, and you'd like to learn more about, Jyoti and I both have our contact information on the last slide. So please feel free to, reach out to us, let us know, and we're happy to try to help if we can.
Thank you both very much. A testament to the Bentley community and the connections you can make within the Bentley network. So thank you and have a great afternoon.